I'm Natalie, and I watched my stepmother deliberately feed my diabetic sister enough sugar to send her into a coma, all while smiling for the cameras at her wellness expo. She called it an accident, but the medical records told a different story. What she didn't know was that our father's will had one very specific clause about Lily's care, and when that lawyer read it aloud 3 weeks later, Victoria's face went white as her organic cotton dress. Because suddenly, the sister she tried to eliminate wasn't just my responsibility anymore. She was my legal ward, and Victoria had just lost everything she thought she'd inherited. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed overhead like trapped insects as I paced the same stretch of linoleum for the 4th hour straight. My sneakers squeaked against the polished floor with each turn, creating a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of my heart. Through the small window in the door, I could see Lily lying motionless in the ICU bed, her 12-year-old body looking impossibly fragile beneath the tangle of wires and monitors. The steady beep of her heart monitor was the only sound keeping me sane, proof that she was still fighting. Victoria had left an hour ago, claiming she needed to handle some urgent business calls. The same woman who had spent the morning posting Instagram stories about family values and natural healing was now nowhere to be found when her stepdaughter lay unconscious from diabetic ketoacidosis. But I wasn't surprised. In the 3 years since she'd married my father, Victoria Sterling had perfected the art of disappearing whenever real responsibility knocked at her door. The irony wasn't lost on me that this had happened at her Sweet Harmony Wellness Expo, an event she'd been planning for months as the grand launch of her holistic health empire. She'd insisted that Lily come along despite my protests, brushing off my concerns with her usual dismissive wave. "It's all natural sugar, Natalie. Ancient wisdom trumps modern medicine every time." Those words echoed in my mind now as I watched my sister's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance. Dr. Jennifer Walsh approached me with the careful stride of someone who'd delivered difficult news countless times before. Her scrubs were wrinkled from what I assumed had been a long shift, and her silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that spoke of efficiency over style. She carried a tablet in one hand and a cup of coffee that looked like it had gone cold hours ago in the other. "Natalie," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of professional compassion, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened today. The levels we're seeing in Lily's blood work are concerning, and the timeline doesn't quite add up to a simple oversight." I stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. "What do you mean?" Dr. Walsh glanced down at her tablet, scrolling through what I assumed were Lily's test results. "Your sister's blood glucose was over 600 when she arrived. That's not something that happens accidentally, especially not in a child who's been managing type 1 diabetes for 3 years. Someone would have had to ignore multiple warning signs or deliberately withhold her insulin for an extended period." The words hit me like cold water. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by a medical professional made my knees weak. I leaned against the wall for support, feeling the cool paint through my thin t-shirt. "You're saying this was intentional?" "I'm saying that based on what I'm seeing, this wasn't an accident. Lily would have been showing symptoms for hours before she collapsed. Excessive thirst, frequent urination, nausea, confusion. These aren't subtle signs that someone could miss, especially someone who's been living with a diabetic child for 3 years. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the events of the morning. Victoria had been in full hostess mode, flitting between vendor booths and posing for photos with her carefully curated smile. She'd brushed off my attempts to check on Lily, telling me to stop being such a helicopter sister and let the girl enjoy herself. When I'd asked about Lily's lunch and insulin schedule, Victoria had waved me away with an airy comment about letting nature take its course. "There's something else," Dr. Walsh continued, her voice dropping lower. "We found multiple types of high-sugar products in her system. Not just 1 or 2 treats, but a systematic consumption of concentrated sugars over several hours. Agave nectar, raw honey, coconut palm sugar, date syrup. It's like someone was conducting an experiment." My stomach churned as I realized what the doctor was implying. Victoria's Expo had featured dozens of vendors selling what she called ancestral sweets and healing confections. Each booth had offered free samples of their products, and Victoria had made a point of having Lily try something from every single vendor. She'd called it a torium experience and had documented the entire thing on her social media feeds. "I need to see those posts," I said suddenly, pulling out my phone. My hands shook as I navigated to Victoria's Instagram account, scrolling through the day's stories. There it was, a carefully curated documentation of Lily's forced sugar tour. In the first video, my sister looked happy and excited, holding a piece of what Victoria called Mayan chocolate ceremony bark. By the fourth video, Lily's face was flushed, and she was leaning against a table for support. By the seventh video, she was sitting down with what Victoria captioned as taking a mindful rest to integrate the healing energies. "Dr. Walsh," I said, turning the phone screen toward her. "You need to see this." The doctor's expression grew darker as she watched the progression of videos. In the final story, posted just 20 minutes before Lily collapsed, Victoria was laughing about how Lily was having such a strong reaction to the pure, unprocessed sugars, and how it showed that her body was releasing years of stored toxins. "I need copies of all of these," Dr. Walsh said firmly. "And I'm required to report this to Child Protective Services. This isn't medical negligence, Natalie. This is deliberate endangerment." The weight of those words settled over me like a lead blanket. I'd known Victoria was self-centered and manipulative, but I'd never imagined she would deliberately harm Lily. My mind raced through the possible motives, landing on the most obvious one with a sickening thud. Dad had been gone for only 2 months, and his will hadn't been read yet. Victoria stood to inherit everything, including guardianship of Lily and control of her substantial trust fund. Everything except the monthly child support payments that came from our biological mother, payments that would stop if Lily died. The realization hit me with such force that I had to sit down in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that lined the hallway. Victoria hadn't just been negligent. She'd been calculating. She'd used her Wellness Expo as cover for what could only be described as an attempted murder, documenting the entire thing on social media while presenting herself as a loving stepmother, introducing her daughter to cultural experiences. My phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "At the lawyer's office handling Dad's estate matters. We'll be back later tonight. Kiss Lily for me." The casual tone of the message, combined with the timing, made my blood run cold. While her stepdaughter fought for her life in the ICU, Victoria was positioning herself to inherit everything that would have been Lily's. But Victoria had made one critical miscalculation. She didn't know about the conversation I'd had with Dad just 3 weeks before he died. He'd called me late one evening, his voice heavy with concerns he'd been carrying for months. "Natalie," he'd said, "I need to tell you something about the will. If anything happens to me, and if Victoria ever puts Lily in danger, there's a provision. A safeguard I put in place because I was starting to see things that worried me. At the time, I'd thought he was being paranoid. Victoria could be thoughtless and self-absorbed, but I couldn't imagine her actually harming a child. Dad had insisted on walking me through the legal details anyway, making me promise to remember them exactly. The guardianship isn't automatic," he'd explained. "It's conditional on Lily's safety and well-being. If there's ever evidence of neglect or endangerment, guardianship automatically transfers to you, along with all assets designated for Lily's care." Dr. Walsh returned with a social worker and 2 police officers, their presence in the sterile hallway making everything feel surreal and official. As I gave my statement and handed over screenshots of Victoria's social media posts, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. The social worker, a kind-faced woman named Patricia Hernandez, explained that they would be conducting a full investigation and that Lily would be placed in protective custody as soon as she was medically stable. "What does that mean for guardianship?" I asked, thinking about Dad's hidden provision. "That depends on what the investigation reveals and what the father's will stipulates," Patricia explained. "If there's evidence of deliberate endangerment, the court will need to review all custody arrangements. Do you know if your father made any specific provisions for Lily's care?" I nodded, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time in hours. He did. He was very specific about it. The next few hours blurred together in a haze of medical updates, legal consultations, and painful phone calls to family members. Aunt Diane drove down from Seattle as soon as I called her, arriving at the hospital with tears in her eyes and a fierce determination to help however she could. She'd never trusted Victoria, and the news of what had happened only confirmed her worst suspicions. "Your father suspected something like this might happen," she told me quietly as we sat in the family waiting room. "He came to visit me last month, and he was so worried about Lily's safety. He said Victoria had been asking too many questions about the trust fund and making comments about how much easier life would be without the complications of a diabetic child." As evening fell and the hospital shifted into its nighttime rhythm, Victoria finally returned. She swept into the ICU waiting area like she was making a grand entrance at one of her wellness events, carrying a bouquet of organic flowers and wearing an expression of practiced concern. Her designer yoga outfit looked fresh and unwrinkled, and her makeup had been perfectly retouched. She looked like someone who had spent the day at a spa.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Not someone whose stepdaughter had nearly died under her care. "How is she?" Victoria asked, her voice pitched at exactly the right level of worry for anyone who might be listening. "I've been praying and sending healing energy all afternoon." I stared at her in disbelief. "You've been at the lawyer's office." "I had to handle some urgent estate matters," she said, not missing a beat. "Your father would have wanted me to take care of the legal details so we could focus on Lily's recovery." The audacity of her response left me speechless for a moment. Here was a woman who had deliberately poisoned a child with sugar, then spent the day positioning herself to profit from that child's potential death, and she was standing in a hospital ICU talking about healing energy and family priorities. "Mrs. Sterling?" Patricia Hernandez approached us with the same careful professionalism she'd shown earlier. "I need to speak with you about the investigation into today's events." Victoria's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, her eyes flickering with something that looked like panic before she recovered her composure. "Investigation? I don't understand. Lily had an accident. These things happen with diabetic children." "Actually, they don't," Dr. Walsh said, joining our small group. "Not when proper care is being provided. We have evidence that suggests Lily's condition today was the result of deliberate negligence, possibly worse." I watched Victoria's face carefully as the implications sank in. She'd built her entire public persona around being a healing goddess who promoted natural wellness and family harmony. The suggestion that she'd deliberately harmed a child would destroy everything she'd worked to create, not to mention potentially landing her in prison. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Victoria said, her voice taking on the honey-sweet tone she used when she was trying to manipulate someone. "I'm a wellness practitioner. I would never do anything to harm a child. Lily wanted to try the natural sweets at my expo, and I thought it would be a good learning experience for her. How was I supposed to know that ancient superfoods would cause such a reaction?" Quote, Patricia exchanged a look with Dr. Walsh before responding. "Mrs. Sterling, we have documentation showing that you ignored multiple warning signs of diabetic distress and continued to give Lily high-sugar products even after she began showing symptoms. We also have your own social media posts describing her deteriorating condition as a positive response to toxin release." The color drained from Victoria's face as she realized that her carefully documented social media presence had become evidence against her. She'd been so focused on building her brand and showing off her lifestyle that she'd created a digital trail of her own crime. "I want to speak to my lawyer," Victoria said quietly, the wellness guru persona finally cracking completely. As the police officers stepped forward to escort Victoria to the station for formal questioning, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over me. Justice was finally beginning to unfold, but the real work of protecting Lily and rebuilding our lives was just beginning. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Victoria had spent 3 years positioning herself as Lily's savior, the spiritual mother who would guide her toward natural healing and away from the medical establishment's toxic interventions. She'd criticized every aspect of Lily's diabetes management, from her insulin pump to her dietary restrictions, always pushing for more natural alternatives that would supposedly cure her condition entirely. But in the end, it was Victoria's own obsession with natural wellness that had provided the perfect murder weapon. She'd used her expo and her social media platform to create what looked like an innocent cultural experience, while systematically poisoning a diabetic child with concentrated sugars. If not for her compulsive need to document everything for her followers, she might have gotten away with it. As I sat beside Lily's bed that night, watching her vital signs slowly stabilize, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Dad just before he died. He'd been so worried about Victoria's increasing obsession with Lily's trust fund and her growing resentment toward the daily realities of caring for a diabetic child. He'd seen warning signs that I'd been too trusting to recognize. "She's not maternal," he'd told me during that late-night phone call. "She's performative. There's a difference, and it matters when you're talking about a child's safety." Now I understood what he'd meant. Victoria had never seen Lily as a daughter to love and protect. She'd seen her as a prop for her wellness brand and an obstacle to her financial security. When the opportunity arose to eliminate both problems at once, she'd taken it without hesitation. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Marcus Chen, Dad's estate attorney, called to inform me that the will reading had been moved up due to the circumstances surrounding Lily's hospitalization. Victoria's actions had triggered the very provision Dad had put in place to protect his daughter. "Your father was very specific about this," Marcus explained during our phone conversation. "If there was ever evidence of deliberate endangerment or neglect of Lily, guardianship and all associated assets would immediately transfer to you. Given what happened yesterday, we need to formalize this transfer as quickly as possible." I felt a surge of gratitude toward my father's foresight, but also a deep sadness that his worst fears had come true. He'd known that Victoria might eventually show her true colors, and he'd prepared for it the only way he could. Even in death, he was still protecting his daughters. The will reading was scheduled for the following afternoon, giving me just enough time to arrange for Lily's continued care and gather the documentation needed to support the guardianship transfer. Patricia Hernandez assured me that CPS would support the change in custody given the evidence of deliberate endangerment, and Dr. Walsh provided detailed medical records showing the systematic nature of Victoria's actions. As I prepared for what would undoubtedly be a confrontational legal proceeding, I thought about the new life I'd need to build for Lily and myself. We'd need a new home, away from the memories of Victoria's manipulative presence. We'd need a new support system, built around people who genuinely cared about Lily's well-being, rather than their own social media presence. Most importantly, we'd need to heal from the trauma of realizing that someone who was supposed to protect us had instead tried to destroy us. But for the first time since Dad's death, I felt hopeful about the future. Victoria's mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator underneath. The truth was out, justice was coming, and Lily would never again be at the mercy of someone who saw her diabetes as an inconvenience, rather than a manageable condition that was just one part of who she was. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady rhythm of machines monitoring Lily's recovery. She was still unconscious, but her numbers were improving steadily. Dr. Walsh had said she expected a full recovery, both physically and cognitively. The real healing, though, would take much longer. It would take time for Lily to process what had happened to her, and even longer for her to trust again after being betrayed by someone who was supposed to love her unconditionally. As I held her small hand in mine, I made a silent promise that I would spend the rest of my life making sure she felt safe and valued. Victoria had tried to erase her, but instead, she'd only made our bond stronger. Tomorrow would bring the official transfer of guardianship, and with it, the resources and legal authority to give Lily the life Dad had always wanted for her. The story was far from over, but for the first time in months, I felt like we were finally heading toward a chapter where love would triumph over manipulation, and truth would expose the lies that had nearly destroyed us. Victoria's wellness empire would crumble under the weight of her own documented crimes, but Lily and I would emerge stronger, wiser, and finally free to build a future based on genuine care, rather than performative perfection. The conference room at Chen & Associates smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, a combination that should have been comforting but instead made my stomach churn with anxiety. I sat across from Victoria at the mahogany table, watching her fidget with her rose quartz bracelet, while Marcus Chen arranged documents with methodical precision. She'd shown up wearing all white, as if she were attending a spiritual cleansing ceremony rather than a will reading that would determine my sister's future. Lily was still in the hospital, conscious now but weak, her small voice asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that the woman who'd been playing stepmother for 3 years had deliberately tried to kill her? How do you tell a child that her near-death experience wasn't an accident but a calculated attempt at murder disguised as a wellness event? Marcus cleared his throat and opened the sealed envelope containing Dad's final wishes. Before we begin, I want everyone to understand that this will contains conditional clauses that were activated by recent events. Robert Brooks was very specific about the circumstances under which these provisions would take effect. Victoria straightened in her chair, her meditation guru composure finally showing cracks around the edges. She'd spent the morning posting about navigating unexpected challenges with grace and trusting the universe's plan, but I could see the fear lurking behind her carefully applied makeup. Her wellness empire was already crumbling as news of Lily's hospitalization spread through her community. Sponsors were pulling out, speaking engagements were being canceled, and her social media comments were filled with accusations and demands for answers. The primary beneficiary of Robert's estate was to be his surviving spouse, Victoria Sterling Brooks. Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of legal formality. However, this inheritance was contingent upon the continued safety and well-being of his minor daughter, Lily Brooks. I watched Victoria's face go pale beneath her bronzer. She'd known about the will's existence, but Dad had been careful to keep the specific terms private. Now she was learning for the first time that her inheritance had strings attached, strings that her own actions had just severed. Marcus pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal photographs, medical records, and printed screenshots from Victoria's social media accounts. Evidence has come to light showing deliberate endangerment of the minor child, including documented evidence of systematic sugar poisoning during a diabetic crisis. As per the conditional clause outlined in Section 7 of this will, these actions void the spousal inheritance entirely. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Victoria's carefully constructed world was burning down around her, and she was just beginning to understand the scope of the devastation. Her Instagram account had been her downfall, the very platform she'd used to build her brand becoming the documentation of her crime. Instead, Marcus continued, full guardianship of Lily Brooks, along with all assets designated for her care, including the family home, education trust, and medical fund, transfer immediately to Natalie Brooks. This includes the business assets and properties that were originally designated as spousal inheritance, as they are now considered necessary for the child's continued welfare. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language, her mouth opening and closing without sound. 3 years of positioning herself as the grieving widow and devoted stepmother had just evaporated in the span of 5 minutes. Not only was she losing the inheritance she'd counted on, but she was also facing criminal charges for attempted murder. "This can't be legal," she finally whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm his wife, I have rights." Marcus reached for another folder. "Actually, Mrs. Sterling, your marriage contract included specific provisions about child welfare. Your husband was very thorough in protecting his daughter's interests. Additionally, these inheritance terms become null and void if there's evidence of criminal endangerment, which the police investigation has now confirmed." I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness washing over me. Dad had seen this coming somehow, had known that Victoria's true nature would eventually surface. He'd prepared for it the only way he could, ensuring that Lily would be protected even if he wasn't there to defend her. But it broke my heart that his worst fears had come true. Victoria's spiritual advisor mask finally cracked completely. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "The expo was supposed to be educational. I was showing her natural alternatives. How was I supposed to know that ancient healing foods would cause such a reaction?" Because you've lived with a diabetic child for 3 years, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Because every single product you gave her was labeled with its sugar content. Because she was showing symptoms for hours before she collapsed, and you ignored all of them while documenting her deterioration for your followers. Marcus pulled out a printed timeline that the police had created using Victoria's own social media posts. The evidence shows a systematic pattern of feeding high-sugar products to a diabetic child while withholding insulin and ignoring obvious symptoms of diabetic ketoacidosis. This wasn't negligence, Mrs. Sterling. This was deliberate. The timeline was damning in its clarity. Victoria had started Lily's, quote, cultural food journey at 9 in the morning with what she'd called ceremonial cacao paste, containing over 40 grams of natural sugars. By 10:30, she'd posted a video of Lily trying, quote, traditional honey cakes, while commenting on how the girl seemed unusually energetic. By noon, she'd documented Lily's consumption of date syrup, agave nectar, and coconut palm sugar, while noting that the child was releasing stored toxins through increased thirst. Every single post showed Victoria's awareness of Lily's deteriorating condition, paired with her deliberate decision to continue the sugar assault. She'd even posted about Lily's requests for water and bathroom breaks, framing them as positive signs of detoxification rather than recognizing them as classic symptoms of diabetic crisis. The medical expert who reviewed this timeline estimates that Lily consumed over 300 grams of concentrated sugars between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m., Marcus continued. For a 70-pound diabetic child, this amount would be potentially fatal without immediate insulin intervention. Mrs. Sterling documented withholding insulin during this entire period, claiming it would interfere with the natural healing process. Victoria's hands were shaking now, her rose quartz bracelet clicking against the table as she fidgeted. I thought I was helping her. My followers said that diabetes could be cured through proper nutrition and spiritual alignment. I was trying to heal her. By poisoning her, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. You used your wellness platform to conduct a medical experiment on a child, documenting every step while she nearly died in front of your cameras. The truth was even darker than that. Over the past few days, I'd been piecing together the timeline of Victoria's actions leading up to the expo. She'd been researching Lily's trust fund extensively, asking pointed questions about what would happen to the money if something happened to my sister. She'd also been consulting with financial advisors about liquidating assets, and had even looked into properties in Costa Rica, where extradition would be difficult. Marcus opened another folder containing bank records and travel documents. We've also discovered that Mrs. Sterling had begun liquidating assets and had purchased a one-way ticket to San Jose, Costa Rica, departing 3 days after the expo. This suggests premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of negligence. Quote, the evidence was overwhelming. Victoria hadn't just failed to care for Lily properly, she'd planned an elaborate murder disguised as a wellness event, complete with social media documentation to provide cover and a ready escape plan to avoid consequences. She'd turned my sister's medical condition into a weapon, using the very platform she'd built to promote healing as a stage for attempted homicide. Furthermore, Marcus continued, the investigation has revealed that Mrs. Sterling had been researching methods of inducing diabetic coma for several weeks prior to the expo. Her internet search history includes queries about natural ways to raise blood sugar, how much sugar is lethal for diabetics, and HEPL countries without extradition treaties. Victoria's face had gone completely white, her carefully maintained spiritual composure dissolving into raw panic. She'd been caught in a web of her own making, her digital footprint providing a detailed map of her murderous intentions. Every Instagram post, every Google search, every financial transaction had become evidence of premeditation. I want to make a deal, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll give up any claim to the inheritance if the criminal charges are reduced. Marcus shook his head. Mrs. Sterling, you're not in a position to negotiate. The inheritance was already voided by your actions, and the criminal charges are being handled by the district attorney's office. This meeting is simply to formalize the guardianship transfer and asset distribution. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. Victoria had gambled everything on a plan that she thought was foolproof. but she'd underestimated both Dad's protective instincts and her own compulsive need to document every aspect of her life. Her social media addiction had become her downfall, providing prosecutors with a detailed confession that she'd unwittingly created herself. "What about my business?" she asked desperately. "My brand, my followers, my speaking engagements?" I almost felt sorry for her in that moment. Victoria had built her entire identity around being a wellness guru, a spiritual teacher who guided others toward natural healing and enlightened living. Now she was revealed as a fraud who'd used those same principles as cover for attempted murder. Her followers were abandoning her in droves, sharing their own stories of dangerous advice she'd given and questioning every aspect of her teachings. "Your business assets were purchased using funds from your husband's estate," Marcus explained. "Since those funds were designated for family welfare, they're now part of Lily's trust. The wellness center, the online courses, the supplement line, everything transfers to the child you attempted to harm." The irony was perfect in its cruelty. Victoria's wellness empire, built on the promise of natural healing and spiritual transformation, would now fund the medical care of the diabetic child she'd tried to kill. Every dollar she'd made promoting dangerous alternatives to proven medical treatments would go toward ensuring Lily had access to the best diabetes management available. Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is insane. You can't just take everything I've worked for." "Actually," Marcus said calmly, "your husband anticipated this possibility. He included specific language about assets acquired through marital funds being held in trust for his daughter's welfare. Since those assets were used in the commission of a crime against that same daughter, they're automatically forfeited." The legal language was complex, but the reality was simple. Dad had created an ironclad protection system for Lily, one that activated the moment Victoria revealed her true intentions. Every safeguard he'd put in place was now protecting his daughter from the woman who'd tried to destroy her. As Victoria gathered her purse and prepared to leave, she turned to me with one final attempt at manipulation. "You know I loved her, right? I really thought I was helping. The wellness community says that diabetes is just stored trauma, and I thought if I could help her release it naturally." I stared at her, this woman who'd spent 3 years playing the role of loving stepmother while planning my sister's death. "You poisoned a child for money, Victoria. Everything else is just lies you're telling yourself." She left without another word, her white outfit making her look like a ghost haunting the scene of her own demise. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Marcus and me alone with the documents that would reshape our lives. "Your father was a very wise man," Marcus said quietly. "He saw this coming long before anyone else did." I nodded, thinking about all the conversations Dad and I had shared about Victoria's true nature. He'd been watching her carefully, noting the small signs of resentment and calculation that I'd been too trusting to see. Her comments about Lily being, quote, high maintenance, her suggestions that insulin pumps were unnatural, her increasing obsession with the girl's trust fund. Dad had seen the pattern forming and had prepared accordingly. The paperwork took another 2 hours to complete, but by the end of the afternoon, I was officially Lily's legal guardian, with full control over her medical decisions, education, and financial future. The house where Victoria had played mistress for 3 years was now ours, along with the business empire she'd built using Dad's money. Most importantly, Lily would never again be at the mercy of someone who saw her diabetes as a burden, rather than simply one aspect of who she was. As I drove back to the hospital, I thought about the conversation I'd need to have with Lily about our new living arrangement. She was still processing the trauma of her hospitalization, still trying to understand why Victoria wasn't visiting, and why strange adults kept asking her questions about what had happened at the expo. Eventually, she'd need to know the full truth, but for now, it was enough that she was safe. The hospital parking garage was nearly empty in the late afternoon, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls as I made my way to the elevators. Lily was sitting up in bed when I arrived, working on a puzzle that Aunt Diane had brought from Seattle. Her color was better, and the IV had been removed, leaving only the continuous glucose monitor that would help us track her recovery. "How did the meeting go?" she asked. not looking up from the 1,000-piece landscape she was assembling on her rolling bed table. I sat down in the chair beside her bed, unsure how much to reveal. Victoria won't be living with us anymore. It's going to be just you and me from now on. Lily's hands stilled over the puzzle pieces. Because of what happened at the expo? Because it's what Dad wanted, I said carefully. He made sure you'd always be taken care of, no matter what. She nodded slowly, her 12-year-old mind processing implications that no child should have to understand. I knew something was wrong that day. I kept telling her I felt sick, but she said it was just my body learning to process natural sugars. She said I needed to trust the healing process. The words hit me like a physical blow. Lily had been aware of what was happening to her, had tried to advocate for her own safety, but Victoria had used her authority and supposed expertise to override a child's instincts. She'd weaponized her role as a wellness teacher to convince Lily that her body's distress signals were actually signs of healing. You did nothing wrong, I told her firmly. Adults are supposed to protect children, not use their trust against them. What happened to you was not your fault. Lily looked up from her puzzle, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Is she going to prison? I nodded. Probably. What she did was very serious, and there are consequences for hurting children. Good, Lily said quietly, returning her attention to the puzzle. Maybe other kids will be safer now. Her matter-of-fact response broke my heart and filled me with pride simultaneously. Even after being betrayed by someone who was supposed to love her, Lily was thinking about protecting other children from similar harm. Victoria had tried to destroy her spirit along with her body, but she'd failed completely. Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway, chart in hand and a smile on her face. Good news! All of Lily's numbers are stable, and we're ready to start discharge planning. With proper monitoring and care, she should be able to go home in the next couple of days. Home, the word carried new weight now. It wouldn't be the house where Victoria had played queen for 3 years, surrounded by her crystals and essential oils and dangerous advice. It would be a real home, where Lily's medical needs were respected and her voice was heard, where diabetes was treated as a manageable condition rather than a spiritual failing that needed to be healed through faith and sugar. As I watched Lily work on her puzzle, I thought about the future we'd build together. It wouldn't be easy. She'd need therapy to process the trauma of Victoria's betrayal, and I'd need to learn how to be a guardian rather than just a big sister. But we'd face it together, supported by people who genuinely cared about our well-being, rather than their own social media presence. Victoria's wellness empire was already crumbling under the weight of her documented crimes. News outlets were picking up the story, examining the dangerous advice she'd given to thousands of followers over the years. Other families were coming forward with their own stories of harm caused by her recommendations, creating a pattern of negligence that went far beyond what had happened to Lily. But none of that mattered as much as the small victory happening right in front of me. Lily was safe, she was healing, and she would never again be at the mercy of someone who saw her medical condition as an inconvenience to be eliminated. Dad's love had protected her even from the grave, and now it was my turn to continue that protection for as long as she needed it. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain but filled with possibility. Victoria had tried to write the ending to Lily's story, but she'd failed to account for the power of genuine love and careful planning. Now we gotta write our own ending, one built on truth instead of manipulation, medical science instead of dangerous pseudoscience, and real family bonds instead of performative spirituality. As the sun set outside Lily's hospital window, painting the room in warm golden light, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Dad's death: hope. Not the toxic positivity that Victoria had peddled, but real hope based on concrete plans and legal protections, and the knowledge that we were finally free to build a life based on truth rather than lies. The moving truck pulled away from our old house on Maple Street, leaving behind 3 years of memories I was grateful to forget. Lily stood beside me on the front steps of our new place in Selwood, a cozy duplex with hardwood floors and windows that actually opened properly. The morning air carried the scent of cherry blossoms from the tree in our front yard, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of essential oils that had permeated our previous home. It feels different here, Lily said quietly, adjusting the strap of her new glucose monitor bag. Lighter somehow. I knew exactly what she meant. This house didn't carry the weight of Victoria's manipulative energy, or the constant tension of walking on eggshells around someone whose mood could shift without warning. Here, we could breathe freely without worrying about accidentally disrupting someone's meditation practice or violating the latest wellness rule Victoria had discovered on Instagram. The first week in our new home passed peacefully, filled with the simple routines of unpacking boxes and establishing new patterns. Lily's diabetes management became refreshingly straightforward without Victoria's constant interference. No more arguments about whether insulin was natural enough or debates about the spiritual significance of blood sugar readings. Just careful monitoring, proper medication, and the relief of treating a medical condition like the manageable health issue it actually was. Dr. Walsh had connected us with a pediatric endocrinologist who specialized in trauma-informed diabetes care, understanding that Lily's recent experience had created anxiety around food and medication that needed addressing alongside her physical recovery. Dr. Sarah Kim was everything Victoria wasn't: evidence-based, gentle, and completely focused on Lily's actual well-being rather than promoting any particular ideology. The beautiful thing about modern diabetes management, Dr. Kim explained during our first appointment, is that with proper care, diabetic children can live completely normal lives. No restrictions on activities, no limitations on dreams, just awareness and preparation. Lily absorbed this information with the hunger of someone who'd been starved of honest medical guidance. For 3 years, Victoria had filled her head with dangerous nonsense about diabetes being a spiritual failing that could be cured through positive thinking and dietary extremism. Now she was learning that her condition was simply a matter of biology, no more shameful than needing glasses or having allergies. But our peaceful new beginning was shattered on a Tuesday morning, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered it. "Natalie?" The voice was soft, tentative, almost childlike. It took me a moment to recognize it as Victoria's, stripped of its usual commanding tone. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I really need to talk to you." My first instinct was to hang up immediately, but something in her voice made me pause. She sounded broken in a way I'd never heard before, as if the confident wellness guru persona had completely disintegrated. "What do you want, Victoria?" "I'm in trouble," she said, her voice cracking. "Big trouble. The criminal charges, the civil lawsuits, the media attention. It's all spiraling out of control. My lawyer says I need character witnesses, people who can testify that I'm not the monster they're making me out to be." I almost laughed at the audacity. "You want me to be a character witness? For the woman who tried to kill my sister?" "I never tried to kill anyone," she protested, though the words lacked conviction. "I made mistakes, yes, but my intentions were good. I was trying to help Lily heal naturally. The wellness community has been doing this for centuries, using food as medicine, trusting the body's natural wisdom." The familiar rhetoric made my stomach turn. Even now, facing criminal charges and financial ruin, Victoria was still clinging to the pseudoscientific beliefs that had nearly cost Lily her life. She genuinely seemed to believe that her intentions somehow absolved her of responsibility for the consequences. "Victoria, you systematically poisoned a diabetic child while documenting her deterioration for social media. There's nothing natural or healing about that. The prosecutors are twisting everything," she continued, her voice taking on the desperate edge I remembered from her final days in our house. "They're making it sound premeditated, like I planned the whole thing. But you know me, Natalie. You lived with me. You know I'm not capable of deliberately hurting a child." The manipulation was so familiar, so perfectly crafted to exploit any lingering sympathy I might feel. This was Victoria's specialty, repositioning herself as the victim while minimizing the harm she'd caused others. She'd done it countless times during her marriage to Dad, turning every conflict into an opportunity to demonstrate her superior spiritual development and everyone else's failure to understand her enlightened perspective. "Actually, Victoria, I do know you. That's exactly why I won't help you." There was a long pause before she spoke again, And when she did, her voice had shifted to the honey-sweet tone she used when she was preparing to ask for something significant. "I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I was hoping we could put aside our differences for Lily's sake. This media circus isn't good for her either. All these news stories, the social media attention, it's turning her into a victim narrative that will follow her for years." The calculated nature of this approach made my blood run cold. Victoria was trying to use concern for Lily as leverage to gain my cooperation, the same way she'd used wellness rhetoric to justify her attempted murder. She was suggesting that protecting her reputation was somehow equivalent to protecting my sister's privacy. Lily's privacy is important, I agreed carefully, which is why we've been working with victim advocates to limit media exposure. But that has nothing to do with helping you avoid consequences for your actions. "Listen," Victoria said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I know things look bad right now, but I have information that could help both of us. About your father's business dealings, about money that was hidden from the estate. If we work together, we could both benefit financially." The suggestion hit me like a slap. Even facing prison time, Victoria was still scheming, still looking for angles to exploit. Now she was trying to implicate Dad in financial impropriety, attempting to drag his memory through the mud as part of her defense strategy. My father was investigated thoroughly during the estate process. His finances were completely transparent. "Not everything," Victoria insisted. "There were offshore accounts, cryptocurrency investments he kept secret. I have documentation that could change the entire inheritance situation, but I need your cooperation to make it work." I realized with sick certainty that this was another layer of Victoria's manipulation. She was either lying completely about hidden assets, or she was revealing financial crimes she'd committed using Dad's identity after his death. Either way, she was trying to entangle me in whatever schemes she'd been running while playing the grieving widow. "Victoria, this conversation is over. Don't contact me again." "Wait." The desperation in her voice was palpable now. "I'm facing 25 years, Natalie. 25 years for trying to help a child heal naturally. The system is broken, and they're using me as a scapegoat for everyone who questions mainstream medicine." The victim narrative was so perfectly constructed, so thoroughly divorced from reality, that it would have been impressive if it weren't so dangerous. Victoria had transformed attempted murder into alternative medicine persecution, casting herself as a martyr for the wellness movement rather than acknowledging the harm she'd caused. "You're facing 25 years for systematically poisoning a diabetic child while planning to flee the country. The evidence is overwhelming because you documented everything yourself." "Those social media posts were taken out of context," she protested. "I was sharing an educational journey, showing my followers how traditional foods could support healing. The prosecution is twisting my words to fit their narrative." I ended the call without another word, but the conversation left me shaken. Victoria's complete disconnection from reality was more disturbing than her original crime. At least attempted murder had a clear motive: financial gain. But this delusional reframing of events suggested a level of psychological instability that made her even more dangerous. The phone rang again immediately. This time I let it go to voicemail, but Victoria's message was even more unsettling than our conversation had been. "Natalie, I know you think you're protecting Lily by keeping her away from me, but you're actually putting her in danger. The medical establishment wants to keep her sick because there's no profit in curing diabetes. I was trying to free her from that system, and now they're using her as a weapon against me. Please don't let them turn you against someone who only wanted to help your family heal." The message revealed the depth of Victoria's delusion. She'd constructed an entire conspiracy theory to explain away her criminal behavior, casting herself as a persecuted healer fighting against medical corruption. In her twisted worldview, nearly killing Lily was an act of love that had been misunderstood by a profit-driven healthcare system. I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Patricia Hernandez, the social worker who'd been monitoring our case. This kind of continued contact violated the restraining order, but more importantly, it demonstrated Victoria's ongoing threat to Lily's safety. Someone who could rationalize attempted murder as healing wasn't likely to accept boundaries or legal consequences. Patricia called back within an hour. This is concerning, Natalie. The content of that message shows she's still not accepting responsibility for her actions. We need to document everything and make sure your security measures are adequate. The idea that we might need security measures hadn't occurred to me. Victoria was facing serious criminal charges and civil lawsuits that had already destroyed her business and reputation. I'd assumed she'd be focused on her legal defense rather than continuing to harass us, but the voicemail suggested she was still operating from a place of dangerous delusion. Do you think she'd actually try to contact Lily directly? People who've committed crimes against children often struggle with accepting that they're no longer welcome in those children's lives, Patricia explained. Especially when they've rationalized their behavior as being helpful rather than harmful. The fact that she's framing attempted murder as medical advocacy suggests she might attempt contact under the guise of saving Lily from proper medical care. The conversation prompted me to review our security arrangements with fresh eyes. Our new address wasn't public record yet, and Victoria didn't know about Lily's new school or doctor. But we were living in a relatively small community where information traveled quickly, and Victoria still had followers who might be sympathetic to her narrative. That evening, I sat down with Lily to discuss the phone call without alarming her unnecessarily. At 13, she was mature enough to understand basic safety precautions, and she deserved to know that Victoria had tried to contact us. She called you? Lily's reaction was immediate concern rather than fear. What did she want? She's trying to avoid consequences for what happened at the expo. She wanted me to testify that she's a good person who made innocent mistakes. Lily processed this information with the thoughtfulness that had always impressed me. Did you tell her no? I told her I wouldn't help her, and I explained that what happened to you wasn't a mistake. She's not allowed to contact us anymore, but if she tries, I want you to tell me immediately. Do you think she'll try to contact me at school? The question revealed how well Lily understood Victoria's manipulative nature. Even at 12, she recognized that someone who'd tried to reframe attempted murder as healing might also try to manipulate a child's perception of events. I don't think so, but we're taking precautions just in case. Your teachers know not to release you to anyone except me or Aunt Diane, and we've given them Victoria's photo so they'll recognize her if she shows up. Good, Lily said firmly. I don't want to see her again. Ever. The finality in her voice was both heartbreaking and reassuring. Victoria had destroyed any possibility of a relationship with the child she'd tried to kill, but Lily's clear boundaries suggested she understood the gravity of what had happened and wouldn't be susceptible to future manipulation. Over the next few days, Victoria's attempts at contact escalated. She tried calling from different numbers, sent messages through mutual acquaintances, and even created new social media accounts to send friend requests and private messages. Each attempt revealed new layers of her delusion and manipulation. One message came through Facebook from an account called Healing Truth Seeker, with Victoria's unmistakable writing style. The medical establishment is using your sister to silence alternative healing voices. They're turning a family crisis into a witch hunt against anyone who questions their monopoly on health. Lily's story could inspire millions of families to seek natural healing, but only if you're brave enough to tell the truth about what really happened. Another message arrived via Instagram from Sacred Wellness Warrior. I've been meditating on our situation, and I received guidance that Lily's healing journey isn't complete. The trauma of hospitalization and separation from her spiritual guides has created energetic blockages that only natural healing can address. I'm willing to work with you privately, away from the legal complications, to help her achieve true wellness. Each message was screenshot and forwarded to Patricia and our attorney. They painted a picture of someone completely detached from reality, unable to process that her victim didn't want healing from the person who'd tried to kill her. Victoria seemed genuinely confused by our rejection of her continued involvement in Lily's life, as if attempted murder was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. The most disturbing message came through LinkedIn, of all platforms, from an account called Victoria S. Brooks, Wellness Consultant. I understand you've been advised not to communicate with me directly, but I hope you'll consider the bigger picture. Lily's case is becoming a symbol in the war between natural healing and pharmaceutical profits. By supporting the prosecution's narrative, You're contributing to a system that keeps children sick for financial gain. I'm prepared to offer significant financial compensation in exchange for your cooperation in setting the record straight." The attempted bribery was so blatant, so perfectly documented in writing, that I almost wondered if Victoria was trying to make the prosecutor's case easier. But the message also revealed something more sinister. She was still thinking strategically about financial gain even while facing criminal charges. This wasn't just delusion, it was calculated manipulation wrapped in spiritual rhetoric. I forwarded the message to Marcus Chen, who called within an hour, with barely controlled outrage in his voice. "This constitutes witness tampering and attempted bribery," he said bluntly. "I'm forwarding this to the district attorney immediately. She's essentially confessing to additional crimes while trying to commit new ones." The legal machinery ground into motion with impressive speed. By the end of the week, Victoria had been arrested for violating the restraining order, witness tampering, and attempted bribery. Her bail was revoked, meaning she'd remain in custody until her trial for the original charges of attempted murder and child endangerment. The arrest brought a strange sense of relief. Victoria's continued contact had been wearing on both Lily and me, creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety that we tried to minimize but couldn't entirely escape. Knowing she was in custody eliminated the possibility of surprise confrontations or escalating harassment. But it also highlighted how far removed from reality Victoria had become. Someone operating from a rational perspective would have focused on their legal defense and avoided any contact with their alleged victims. Instead, she'd continued her pattern of manipulation and control, apparently believing she could talk her way out of consequences through the same spiritual rhetoric that had enabled her crimes. Dr. Kim helped us process the psychological impact of Victoria's continued attempts at contact during our next appointment. "It's not uncommon for children to feel guilty when their abusers face consequences," she explained to Lily. "Sometimes there's a sense that if they'd just explained things better, or been more understanding, the whole situation could have been avoided." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "I do feel bad that she's in jail, but I also feel safer knowing she can't contact us anymore." "Both of those feelings are completely normal and valid," Dr. Kim assured her. "Feeling empathy for someone who hurt you doesn't mean you're responsible for their choices or consequences. It just means you're a caring person who wishes things could have been different." The conversation helped clarify something that had been troubling me as well. Victoria's messages had been so desperately manipulative, so clearly the product of someone whose life was falling apart, that it was hard not to feel some pity for her situation. But that pity didn't change the facts of what she'd done or the ongoing danger she represented. As we settled into our new routine without the threat of Victoria's interference, I began to see how much stress her presence had created even before the attempted murder. Lily was sleeping better, eating more freely, and showing interest in activities she'd avoided while living under Victoria's scrutiny. The constant vigilance required to navigate Victoria's unpredictable moods and arbitrary rules had been exhausting for both of us. "I want to try out for the school play," Lily announced one evening while we were making dinner together. "They're doing Into the Woods, and I think I might be good at playing Little Red Riding Hood." The simple statement filled me with joy. For 3 years, Victoria had discouraged Lily's interest in theater, claiming that performing arts were energetically draining and incompatible with spiritual development. She'd redirected Lily toward meditation and nature crafts, activities that looked good in social media posts but didn't align with my sister's actual interests and talents. "That sounds perfect," I said, trying not to let my emotion show too clearly. "Do you want to practice reading for the audition? Would you help me? I'm a little nervous about the singing parts." We spent the evening working on audition pieces, Lily's voice growing stronger and more confident with each run-through. Watching her rediscover interests that Victoria had suppressed felt like witnessing a flower blooming after a long winter. This was who Lily really was, when she wasn't being molded to fit someone else's spiritual agenda. As I tucked her into bed that night, Lily asked a question that showed how much she'd been thinking about our new life. "Do you think I'll always be afraid of people like Victoria? People who seem nice but aren't really?" It was a profound question that deserved a thoughtful answer. "I think you'll always be wise about trusting people, which isn't the same as being afraid. What happened to you taught you to pay attention to actions rather than just words, and that's actually a valuable skill." I noticed that she never actually listened to me, Lily said quietly. Even when I told her I felt sick, she just talked over me with wellness explanations. But you and Dr. Kim actually hear what I'm saying. The observation was remarkably insightful for someone her age, but it also broke my heart. A 12-year-old shouldn't have to analyze the difference between being heard and being manipulated. But since she'd been forced to learn that lesson, I was grateful she'd learned it so clearly. People who really care about you will always make space for your voice, I told her. Even when they disagree with you, or when you're talking about something they don't understand. That's one way to tell the difference between people who love you and people who want to control you. As I turned off her bedroom light and headed to my own room, I reflected on how much we'd both changed in the months since Dad's death. Victoria's manipulation had been so gradual, so carefully disguised as spiritual guidance, that I hadn't recognized the full extent of the damage until we were free from it. Now, in the quiet safety of our new home, we were both rediscovering who we were when we weren't constantly adapting to someone else's expectations. Victoria's arrest had closed one chapter of our story, but it had also opened space for the healing we both needed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: therapy appointments, legal proceedings, the ongoing work of processing trauma while building a stable life. But tonight, Lily was safely asleep in her own room, dreaming about auditions and adventures, rather than hiding from the unpredictable moods of someone who'd claimed to love her while planning her death. The house settled around us with the comfortable creaks of old wood and honest construction. Outside, the cherry tree rustled in the evening breeze, its blossoms catching moonlight like small promises of better days ahead. We were finally free to become whoever we were meant to be, without the distorting lens of Victoria's manipulative presence shaping our choices and limiting our possibilities. For the first time since Dad's death, I fell asleep without checking the locks twice or listening for sounds that didn't belong. Victoria's voice had been silenced, her schemes had been exposed, and her power over our lives had been broken completely. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain but genuinely ours to shape. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath my feet despite the warm September morning, and I could hear the low hum of news vans idling in the parking lot behind us. Lily sat beside me on the concrete bench, her school backpack at her feet and a thermos of carefully measured apple juice in her lap. We'd arrived early for Victoria's trial, not because we were eager to face her again, but because Dr. Kim had suggested that testifying might help Lily reclaim her voice after months of being silenced and manipulated. Remember, you only have to answer the questions they ask you, I reminded her quietly. If you need a break, just look at me and I'll ask the judge for one. Lily nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of her glucose monitor case. She'd grown 3 inches since the incident at the Wellness Expo, her face losing some of its childhood roundness as she approached her 14th birthday. But her eyes still carried shadows that shouldn't exist in someone so young, and I caught her checking her blood sugar levels more frequently than medically necessary, as if the numbers could protect her from uncertainties beyond her control. Marcus Chen approached us with his usual measured stride, his briefcase swinging gently in rhythm with his steps. Over the past few months, he'd become more than just our attorney. He was the steady presence who'd guided us through the complexities of criminal proceedings, while protecting us from the media circus that had erupted around Victoria's case. The prosecution is confident, he said, settling onto the bench beside us. Victoria's legal team tried to suppress her social media posts as prejudicial evidence, but Judge Morrison denied the motion. Every Instagram story, every Facebook post, every piece of content she created that day will be shown to the jury exactly as she published it. The irony still amazed me. Victoria had spent years building her wellness brand through meticulous social media curation, crafting each post to project an image of enlightened motherhood and spiritual authority. Now that same content would be used to prove premeditation and deliberate endangerment. Her compulsive need to document every moment of her life had created an unshakable record of her crimes. What about her followers? Lily asked quietly. The ones who still believe she was trying to help me? It was a perceptive question. Even with Victoria in custody awaiting trial, her online community had remained surprisingly loyal. They'd reframed her arrest as persecution by pharmaceutical interests and painted her as a martyr for alternative medicine. Some had even started a legal defense fund, raising money for her attorneys while spreading conspiracy theories about the medical establishment's alleged plot to silence natural healing advocates. The jury selection process screened out anyone with strong feelings about alternative medicine, Marcus explained. Judge Morrison was very careful about that. The 12 people who'll decide Victoria's fate are ordinary citizens who understand the difference between medical treatment and child endangerment. As we made our way into the courthouse, I noticed familiar faces in the gallery. Aunt Diane had driven down from Seattle again, her presence a comforting reminder that we had family support beyond the legal machinery grinding around us. Dr. Walsh sat in the second row, her medical records and expert testimony ready to explain exactly what Victoria's actions had done to Lily's body. Even Mrs. Garcia, our new neighbor who'd become a surrogate grandmother to Lily, had taken the day off work to show her support. But there were other faces too, people I didn't recognize who clutched crystals and wore t-shirts with Victoria's Wellness brand logo. They'd organized themselves into a small but vocal group of supporters, convinced that Victoria was being railroaded by a corrupt system that profited from keeping children sick. Their presence added an unsettling energy to the proceedings, a reminder that Victoria's influence extended far beyond our family. Victoria herself looked dramatically different from the confident wellness guru who'd nearly killed my sister 18 months ago. Her hair, once perfectly styled and highlighted, hung limp and unwashed around her shoulders. The designer yoga outfits had been replaced by an ill-fitting beige suit that made her skin look sallow under the fluorescent courtroom lights. But most striking was the change in her eyes, where once there'd been calculating manipulation disguised as spiritual wisdom, now there was only vacant defiance, as if she'd retreated so deeply into her delusions that reality could no longer reach her. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park laid out the timeline of Victoria's actions with surgical precision, using Victoria's own social media posts to tell the story of systematic poisoning disguised as cultural education. Each Instagram story was displayed on a large screen for the jury, creating a horrifying progression from excited anticipation to documented medical crisis. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Ada Park began, her voice carrying the weight of documented evidence. This case is not about alternative medicine or parental rights or freedom of speech on social media. This case is about a woman who systematically poisoned a diabetic child while documenting the process for her online followers, then planned to flee the country before facing consequences for her actions. The screen filled with the first video from that terrible day, showing Lily's bright smile as Victoria explained the, quote, ancestral healing journey they were about to embark on. My sister looked so young, so trusting, completely unaware that the woman beside her was planning her death. Over the course of 5 hours, quote, ADA Park continued, the defendant gave Lily Brooks over 300 grams of concentrated sugars, while deliberately withholding insulin and ignoring obvious symptoms of diabetic ketoacidosis. She documented every step of this process on social media, describing the child's deteriorating condition as evidence of successful detoxification. Quote, the progression of videos played in chronological order, and I watched the jury's faces change as they witnessed Lily's transformation from healthy excitement to visible distress. By the 4th video, my sister was clearly struggling, her face flushed and her movements sluggish. By the 7th video, she was barely able to sit upright without support. And through it all, Victoria's commentary remained cheerfully oblivious to the medical emergency unfolding in front of her cameras. The defendant's internet search history reveals that she researched the lethal effects of sugar on diabetic children for weeks before this event. ADA Park continued. She purchased a one-way ticket to Costa Rica, departing 3 days later. And when medical professionals attempted to save Lily's life, the defendant left the hospital to meet with estate attorneys about liquidating assets and claiming her inheritance. Victoria's defense attorney, a nervous-looking man named Robert Fletcher, attempted to paint her actions as misguided but well-intentioned alternative medicine. He spoke passionately about religious freedom and parental rights, arguing that Victoria had genuinely believed she was helping Lily heal naturally. But his arguments felt hollow against the mountain of evidence showing calculation and premeditation. My client is a spiritual healer who dedicated her life to helping others find natural wellness, Fletcher argued. She made tragic mistakes, yes, but those mistakes came from a place of love and a sincere belief in the power of traditional healing methods. The religious freedom angle was particularly cynical given Victoria's documented research into lethal sugar doses and her escape plans. But I understood the strategy. If her attorneys could convince even one juror that this was about spiritual persecution rather than attempted murder, they might be able to avoid a conviction on the most serious charges. When it came time for witness testimony, Dr. Walsh's presentation was methodical and devastating. She walked the jury through Lily's medical records, explaining how each of Victoria's documented actions had contributed to the life-threatening crisis that followed. Diabetic ketoacidosis doesn't happen suddenly, Dr. Walsh explained, using simple language that any layperson could understand. It's a progressive condition with clear warning signs that develop over hours. A caregiver familiar with diabetes would recognize excessive thirst, frequent urination, and behavioral changes as emergency symptoms requiring immediate medical intervention. The prosecution played Victoria's social media posts alongside Dr. Walsh's medical timeline, creating an irrefutable connection between the documented symptoms and Victoria's decision to continue the sugar assault. In one particularly damning video, Victoria actually acknowledged that Lily was asking for water repeatedly, but framed it as evidence that the healing foods were helping her body release stored toxins. In my 30 years of treating diabetic children, Dr. Walsh continued, I have never seen a case where a caregiver documented medical distress so thoroughly while simultaneously refusing to provide appropriate care. This wasn't negligence or ignorance. This was deliberate. When Lily took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. She'd grown so much since the incident, but sitting in the witness chair with the microphone adjusted down to her level, she looked impossibly young and vulnerable. Victoria's supporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, perhaps confronting for the first time the reality that their spiritual leader had targeted a child. Lily's testimony was quiet, but unwavering. She described waking up excited about the cultural food experience, trusting Victoria's explanations about natural healing, and gradually feeling worse throughout the day. Most powerfully, she recounted asking Victoria for her insulin and being told that it would, quote, interfere with the healing process. I knew something was wrong, Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper but clearly audible in the silent courtroom. I felt really sick and scared, but Victoria kept saying it was normal and that I needed to trust the process. She said if I couldn't trust natural healing, it meant I wasn't spiritually ready to be cured. The psychological manipulation embedded in Victoria's spiritual rhetoric was laid bare through Lily's innocent recounting. She described being made to feel guilty for wanting medical care, being told that her fear of the healing crisis was evidence of spiritual weakness, and being convinced that asking for insulin would disappoint the adults who were trying to help her. Did you want to continue eating the foods Victoria was giving you? Ada Park asked gently. No, Lily replied firmly. After the first few things, I felt really sick, and I wanted to stop. But Victoria said we couldn't waste the educational opportunity, and that my body was just learning to process pure foods after years of being poisoned by processed sugars. The defense's cross-examination was brief and largely ineffective. Fletcher tried to suggest that Lily's memories might be confused by trauma or influenced by subsequent conversations, but her testimony remained consistent and detailed. She could recall specific conversations, describe the order of events, and explain her physical sensations with a clarity that spoke to the genuineness of her experience. When Victoria's own social media posts were played during Lily's testimony, the contrast was stark. While my sister described feeling increasingly ill and asking for help, Victoria's videos showed her dismissing these concerns as evidence of successful healing. The disconnect between a child's distress and an adult's spiritual interpretation of that distress was impossible to ignore. The prosecution's presentation of Victoria's internet search history was equally damning. Digital forensics experts had recovered weeks of searches related to diabetes, sugar toxicity, and the legal requirements for proving criminal intent. Victoria had researched how much sugar would be dangerous for a diabetic child, investigated countries with favorable extradition policies, and even looked into methods for disguising premeditation as accidental poisoning. The defendant's browser history shows searches for how to make diabetes worse naturally, legal sugar limit for diabetic children, and best countries to avoid U.S. criminal prosecution, the forensics expert testified. These searches occurred over a period of 6 weeks leading up to the Wellness Expo, with the most frequent searches happening in the 3 days immediately before the event. The financial motive became clear through testimony from banking experts and estate attorneys. Victoria had been systematically draining joint accounts and converting assets to cryptocurrency in the weeks before the expo. She'd also taken out large cash advances on credit cards and had begun the process of transferring business assets to offshore accounts. The pattern suggested someone preparing to disappear permanently, rather than someone planning an innocent cultural education event. Marcus Chen's presentation of the estate provisions was particularly effective in demonstrating Victoria's motive. He explained how Dad's will had included safeguards specifically designed to protect Lily from the kind of endangerment that had actually occurred. Victoria's inheritance was entirely contingent on Lily's safety and well-being, creating a twisted situation where harming the child would eliminate the condition that prevented Victoria from claiming her inheritance. Robert Brooks suspected that his wife might eventually pose a threat to his daughter. Marcus testified. The will's conditional clauses were his attempt to protect Lily even after his death. He believed that if Victoria ever showed her true nature, these legal protections would activate. The prosecution rested their case with a final presentation of Victoria's escape plan. Travel documents, financial records, and communication with contacts in Costa Rica painted a picture of someone who'd expected to be far from U.S. jurisdiction by the time Lily's condition was discovered. Only the speed of Lily's medical crisis and the immediate intervention of hospital staff had prevented Victoria from disappearing before facing consequences. Victoria's defense case was surprisingly brief. Fletcher called a few character witnesses who testified to her reputation in the wellness community, but their testimony felt hollow against the mountain of evidence showing calculated planning and deliberate harm. One witness, a fellow wellness practitioner, actually hurt Victoria's case by describing her, quote, innovative approaches to chronic childhood conditions and her belief that diabetes could be, quote, through spiritual alignment and dietary intervention. Victoria herself chose not to testify, a decision that spoke volumes about her attorneys' confidence in her ability to explain her actions convincingly. The woman who'd built her career on speaking publicly about health and healing apparently had nothing to say when faced with documented evidence of her crimes. The defense's closing argument focused heavily on religious freedom and alternative medicine persecution. But Fletcher's heart clearly wasn't in it. He went through the motions of suggesting reasonable doubt, but the evidence was too overwhelming and too well documented for anything but a conviction. Ada Park's closing statement was a masterclass in connecting evidence to consequences. She methodically walked through Victoria's actions, motivations, and planning while keeping the focus squarely on the harm done to an innocent child. Victoria Sterling Brooks didn't make tragic mistakes, Park concluded. She made deliberate choices. She chose to research lethal sugar doses. She chose to document a child's medical distress for social media content. She chose to withhold life-saving medication while feeding that child increasingly dangerous amounts of concentrated sugars. And she chose to plan an escape to avoid facing the consequences of those choices. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, attempted murder, child endangerment, witness tampering, and fraud, Victoria's supporters in the gallery gasped audibly, but Victoria herself showed no reaction. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead as if she couldn't process the words being spoken. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the guilty verdicts brought immediate relief. Victoria would remain in custody, and the criminal conviction would support our ongoing civil lawsuit to recover damages for Lily's medical expenses and trauma treatment. As we left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, but I kept my focus on getting Lily safely to our car. She'd been brave and strong throughout the trial, but I could see the exhaustion in her shoulders and the way she leaned against me as we walked. "How do you feel?" I asked once we were safely inside the car with the doors locked and the outside noise muted. "Tired," she said honestly, "but also relieved." I was worried that people might believe her story about trying to help me. The jury saw through her lies because you were brave enough to tell the truth. I told her. You helped make sure she can't hurt any other children the way she hurt you. Lily nodded thoughtfully, already processing the experience with the wisdom that had been forced upon her too early. I hope her followers understand now that what she did wasn't healing. It was the opposite of healing. As we drove home through the familiar neighborhoods of our new life, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day at the Wellness Expo. Victoria's conviction wouldn't erase the trauma she'd inflicted, but it provided a sense of justice and closure that would help both Lily and me continue healing. The trial had also revealed the full scope of Victoria's manipulation and planning, details that were somehow both shocking and sadly predictable. She'd spent months positioning herself to commit the perfect crime, using her wellness platform as both cover and documentation for attempted murder. But her compulsive need for social media validation had ultimately provided the evidence needed to convict her. Most importantly, Lily's testimony had been heard and believed. After months of being silenced, manipulated, and nearly killed, she'd been able to tell her story in her own words to a room full of adults who took her seriously. That validation was perhaps more healing than any legal verdict could be. The sentencing hearing would come later, but for now we had closure on the most frightening chapter of our lives. Victoria's mask had been permanently removed, her crimes had been exposed, and her ability to harm other children had been eliminated. We could finally begin the next phase of our healing without looking over our shoulders or wondering if justice would ever come. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed that someone had left a bouquet of sunflowers on our front porch, bright yellow blooms that seemed to capture the hope and resilience that had carried us through the darkest period of our lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and continued healing, but tonight we could rest in the knowledge that truth had triumphed over manipulation, and love had proven stronger than the calculated cruelty that had nearly destroyed us. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of our kitchen window, casting soft shadows across the breakfast table where Lily sat reviewing her lines for the spring musical. 2 years had passed since Victoria's sentencing hearing, where she'd received 28 years in prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. The judge had been particularly harsh in his condemnation, noting that Victoria had violated the most fundamental trust between caregiver and child while using social media to create a permanent record of her victim's suffering. I think I've got the harmonies down for the ensemble pieces, Lily said, humming a few bars while checking her blood glucose levels with the casual efficiency that had become second nature. Mrs. Patterson wants to run through the whole second act after school today. At 16, Lily had grown into a confident young woman whose diabetes was simply one manageable aspect of a full and active life. She played varsity soccer, maintained honor roll grades, and had recently been accepted to a prestigious summer theater program at Portland State University. The shadows that had haunted her eyes during Victoria's trial had faded, replaced by the natural brightness of someone who'd learned early that she could survive anything life threw at her. Dr. Kim had been right about trauma's potential to build resilience, rather than simply leave scars. Lily's experience with Victoria had taught her to trust her own instincts, advocate for her needs, and recognize manipulation when she encountered it. These weren't lessons any child should have to learn, but since life had forced them upon her, she'd transformed them into strengths that served her well in navigating the complexities of adolescence. "Remember you have that interview with the podcast people after school?" I reminded her while packing her glucose supplies and backup snacks into her theater bag. "The producer seemed really interested in your perspective on medical advocacy for young people." The interview was part of a larger project documenting stories of children who'd survived medical abuse and gone on to become advocates for patient rights. Lily had been hesitant at first, worried about revisiting painful memories, but her therapist had encouraged her to view it as an opportunity to help other children recognize dangerous situations and trust their own voices when adults failed to protect them. "I'm nervous about the questions," Lily admitted, adjusting the strap of her insulin pump case. "What if they ask about things I don't remember clearly? Or what if I start crying and can't finish?" "Then you take a break and try again, or you stop entirely if that's what feels right," I told her firmly. "Your story belongs to you, and you get to decide how much of it to share and when to share it. This was a conversation we'd had many times over the past 2 years, as Lily had gradually become more comfortable discussing her experience with Victoria. Initially, she'd been reluctant to talk about it at all, worried that people would see her as damaged or define her entirely by what had happened to her. But as she'd grown older and more confident, she'd begun to see her survival as something that might help other children in similar situations. The doorbell rang, interrupting our morning routine. Through the front window, I could see a delivery truck parked at the curb and a uniformed driver holding a large package. When I opened the door, he handed me an envelope along with the box. "Special delivery for Lily Brooks," he said with a smile. "Looks like someone's excited about your birthday next week." Lily's 17th birthday was still 6 days away, but packages had been arriving all week from friends, family members, and even strangers who'd been following her advocacy work. The envelope contained a note from Aunt Diane, explaining that the package held a complete set of professional-grade stage makeup and character design books, along with a letter of recommendation for the summer theater program. "Aunt Diane really went overboard this year," Lily said, laughing as she examined the expensive makeup collection. "I think she's more excited about the theater program than I am." Aunt Diane had become a constant presence in our lives since Victoria's arrest, visiting monthly and calling weekly to check on both of us. She'd never married or had children of her own, and she'd channeled all of her maternal instincts into supporting Lily's recovery and development. Her relationship with my sister had become one of the most healing aspects of our new life, providing Lily with an adult who loved her unconditionally while having no agenda beyond her happiness and success. As Lily gathered her school supplies and headed for the door, she paused to check her reflection in the hallway mirror. It was a small ritual she'd developed over the past year, not out of vanity but as a way of grounding herself before facing the day. Dr. Kim had suggested it as a method for staying connected to her own sense of identity, rather than letting external pressures or other people's expectations define how she saw herself. "I look like someone who can handle whatever today brings," she said quietly, practicing the affirmation they'd worked on together. "You look like someone who's already handled more than most people face in a lifetime," I replied, meaning every word. After Lily left for school, I settled into my home office to review the final documents from our civil lawsuit against Victoria's estate. The criminal conviction had made the civil case straightforward, resulting in a substantial settlement that would fund Lily's medical care and education for the rest of her life. More importantly, the lawsuit had exposed the financial scope of Victoria's wellness empire, revealing that she'd defrauded dozens of families who'd trusted her with their children's health. The settlement money had allowed us to establish the Lily Brooks Foundation for Medical Advocacy, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating families about the dangers of medical misinformation and providing resources for children who'd experienced medical abuse. It wasn't the future I'd planned when we first moved to our little duplex in Selwood, but it felt like a meaningful way to transform our trauma into something that might protect other families. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chin, who'd remained our attorney and had become a trusted friend over the years of legal proceedings. "Saw the news about Victoria's appeal being denied. Thought you'd want to know it's finally, officially over." Victoria's legal team had exhausted every possible avenue for overturning her conviction, arguing everything from ineffective counsel to prosecutorial misconduct to violations of her religious freedom. But the evidence had been too overwhelming, the documentation too complete, and the harm too severe for any appellate court to find reversible error. Her 28-year sentence was now final, meaning she wouldn't be eligible for parole until 2047, when Lily would be 33 years old and hopefully far beyond the reach of Victoria's toxic influence. The finality brought a sense of closure I hadn't realized I was still seeking. For 2 years, there had always been the possibility that Victoria might find some legal loophole or convince an appeals court that her conviction was unjust. Now there was certainty that she would remain in prison for the better part of 3 decades, unable to harm other children or continue spreading the dangerous medical misinformation that had nearly cost Lily her life. I forwarded Marcus's message to Dr. Kim, who'd been helping both Lily and me process the ongoing legal proceedings and their psychological impact. She'd been particularly helpful in teaching us how to live with the reality that some questions would never have satisfactory answers. Why had Victoria chosen to target Lily specifically? How long had she been planning the attempted murder? What might have happened if we'd recognized the warning signs earlier? These questions had tormented me during the first year after Victoria's arrest, creating a spiral of guilt and second-guessing that threatened to overshadow our recovery. Dr. Kim had patiently helped me understand that seeking perfect explanations for inexplicable cruelty was less important than focusing on the healing and protection that were actually within my control. The afternoon brought a phone call from the podcast producer who'd be interviewing Lily later that day. Sarah Williams ran a show called Young Voices, Strong Choices that featured teenagers who'd overcome significant challenges and developed advocacy platforms around their experiences. She'd reached out to us after hearing about Lily's work with the Medical Advocacy Foundation, intrigued by her unique perspective on medical autonomy and children's rights. "I want to make sure Lily feels completely comfortable with the conversation," Sarah explained during our preliminary call. "We can avoid any topics that feel too personal, and she can stop the recording at any time if she needs a break." The thoughtful approach was exactly what I'd hoped for. Too many media outlets had wanted to focus on the sensational aspects of Victoria's crimes, rather than the more important issues of medical literacy and children's advocacy. Sarah seemed genuinely interested in Lily's perspective on empowering young people to trust their instincts and seek appropriate medical care when adults failed to provide it. "She's nervous but excited," I told Sarah honestly. "This is the first time she's talked publicly about her experience in detail, but she's passionate about helping other kids avoid similar situations." When Lily returned from school that afternoon, she seemed more confident about the interview than she'd been that morning. Her theater rehearsal had gone well, and she'd received encouraging feedback from her director about her audition for the summer program. Success in areas she was passionate about had become an important part of her healing process, providing evidence that Victoria's attempt to define her identity around trauma and medical dependency had failed completely. The podcast interview took place in our living room, with Sarah using professional recording equipment that somehow made our familiar space feel more formal and significant. She began with easy questions about Lily's current activities and interests, gradually building trust and comfort before moving into more sensitive territory. "You've become an advocate for medical literacy and children's rights," Sarah said gently. "Can you tell us what inspired that advocacy work?" Lily took a deep breath, glancing at me briefly before answering. "When I was 12, someone I trusted tried to convince me that my diabetes could be cured through natural healing. She made me feel guilty for wanting insulin and told me that trusting medical science meant I wasn't spiritually evolved enough to heal naturally. I almost died because I believed her instead of listening to my own body." The simple, direct explanation captured the essence of Victoria's manipulation without getting lost in complex details about the Wellness Expo or the criminal proceedings. Lily had learned to tell her story in a way that focused on the lessons rather than the trauma, making it accessible to other young people who might be facing similar pressures. Quote, "What would you want other kids to know about trusting their instincts when adults give them confusing or dangerous advice about their health?" Sarah asked. "Your body belongs to you," Lily replied firmly. "Adults might have good intentions, but if something feels wrong or dangerous, you have the right to ask questions and seek help. Medical conditions aren't moral failings, and you don't have to earn the right to proper treatment by being spiritual enough or positive enough or anything else." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from social media literacy to the importance of having trusted adults who prioritize children's actual well-being over their own beliefs or agendas. Lily spoke with the wisdom of someone who'd been forced to mature quickly, but also with the hope of someone who'd discovered her own strength and resilience. "Do you ever worry about people not believing your story or thinking you're exaggerating what happened?" Sarah asked toward the end of the interview. "Sometimes," Lily admitted, "but I have medical records and legal documents and lots of evidence that proves what happened. More importantly, I know what I experienced, and I trust my own memories. Nobody can take that away from me or convince me it was different than it was." The confidence in her voice filled me with pride. This was perhaps the most important lesson Lily had learned through her recovery, the ability to trust her own perceptions and experiences, rather than allowing others to rewrite her reality to suit their purposes. Victoria had spent months gaslighting her about her medical needs and physical sensations, but that manipulation had ultimately failed to take root. After Sarah packed up her equipment and left, Lily and I sat in the kitchen sharing a late afternoon snack while she worked on homework. The normalcy of the moment felt precious. A teenage girl complaining about algebra while checking her blood sugar and planning her weekend activities. This was the life Victoria had tried to steal from her, and this was the life we'd fought to reclaim and protect. How did it feel to talk about everything so openly? I asked. Scary at first, but then empowering, Lily replied thoughtfully. I kept thinking about how I felt when I was 12, and nobody was really listening to me. If this interview helps even one kid trust their instincts or ask for help when they need it, then it was worth feeling nervous. That evening brought a family dinner with Aunt Diane, who'd driven down from Seattle to celebrate the podcast interview and help with final preparations for Lily's birthday party. She arrived with her arms full of groceries and her head full of elaborate plans for decorating the community center we'd rented for the celebration. I may have gone a little overboard with the theater theme, she admitted while unpacking bags of gold and silver streamers. But 17 is a special birthday, especially for someone who's accomplished as much as our Lily has. The party planning felt wonderfully normal, the kind of mundane family activity that had been impossible during the years when Victoria's unpredictable moods and arbitrary rules had dominated our household. Now we could make decisions based simply on what would make Lily happy, without worrying about how our choices might trigger someone else's spiritual crisis or social media drama. I invited some of the kids from the medical advocacy group, Lily told Aunt Diane while helping arrange party supplies. They're excited to meet you and hear about your work with the Youth Mentorship Program in Seattle. Over the past year, Lily had connected with other teenagers who'd experienced medical abuse or neglect, forming a support network that met monthly to share experiences and develop advocacy strategies. The group had become an important part of her healing process, providing peer relationships with young people who understood the unique challenges of recovering from adult betrayal while navigating adolescent development. As we worked together preparing for the party, I reflected on how much our family dynamics had changed since Victoria's imprisonment. Without her manipulative presence creating artificial drama and competition, Lily and I had developed a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. We argued sometimes, like any siblings navigating the transition from childhood to adulthood, but our conflicts were honest and temporary, rather than the carefully orchestrated emotional warfare that Victoria had specialized in. I've been thinking about college applications, Lily mentioned casually while folding napkins. Dr. Kim thinks I should consider schools with strong pre-med programs, since I'm interested in pediatric endocrinology. The career choice made perfect sense for someone who'd experienced both excellent and dangerously inadequate medical care. Lily had developed a sophisticated understanding of diabetes management and patient advocacy that went far beyond what most teenagers knew about healthcare. She'd also demonstrated remarkable skill at explaining complex medical concepts in accessible language, a talent that would serve her well in clinical practice. What about the theater program? I asked. You've worked so hard developing those skills. I think medicine and theater actually complement each other really well, she replied thoughtfully. Understanding how to connect with people emotionally and communicate clearly are important in both fields. Plus, the advocacy work has shown me how much I enjoy helping people navigate complex systems and find their voices. Aunt Diane beamed with pride as she listened to Lily's mature perspective on her future goals. Your father would be so proud of the young woman you've become, she said softly. He always knew you had the strength to overcome whatever challenges life threw at you. The mention of Dad brought a familiar mixture of sadness and gratitude. I missed him every day, but I was profoundly grateful for the legal protections he'd put in place that had ultimately saved Lily's life. His foresight and careful planning had made it possible for us to rebuild our lives without the financial stress that might have complicated our healing process. Sometimes I wonder what he'd think about everything that's happened, Lily said quietly. Do you think he suspected that Victoria was dangerous, or was he just being cautious? It was a question we'd discussed many times with Dr. Kim, trying to understand Dad's motivations for the conditional clauses in his will. Based on conversations he'd had with Aunt Diane and Marcus Chen, it seemed that he'd recognized Victoria's manipulative tendencies and her growing resentment toward Lily's medical needs. But he probably hadn't anticipated the extent of her willingness to cause harm. "I think he loved you enough to prepare for possibilities he hoped would never happen," Aunt Diane replied. "That's what good parents do. They try to protect their children even from scenarios they can't fully imagine." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Through the peephole, I could see Mrs. Garcia holding a covered dish and smiling expectantly. She'd become an unofficial grandmother to Lily over the past 2 years, providing the kind of unconditional love and practical support that had been missing during Victoria's reign of manipulation and control. "I brought my famous tres leche cake for tomorrow's party," she announced, bustling into the kitchen with her characteristic energy. "And I have news about the community garden project that I think Lily will be excited about." Mrs. Garcia had been instrumental in helping us integrate into our Selwood neighborhood, introducing us to families and activities that had nothing to do with wellness culture or social media performance. Her approach to community building was refreshingly straightforward. She believed in showing up for people when they needed help and celebrating with them when good things happened. The Neighborhood Association approved funding for the Children's Diabetes Education Program, she continued excitedly. They want to use Lily's advocacy materials as the foundation for workshops that teach families about proper medical management and how to recognize dangerous misinformation. The program was something Lily had proposed during a community meeting 6 months earlier, inspired by her realization that many families in our area lacked access to quality diabetes education. She'd developed age-appropriate materials explaining blood sugar management, emergency recognition, and the importance of following medical rather than spiritual advice when dealing with serious health conditions. "That's amazing!" Lily exclaimed, her face lighting up with genuine excitement. "Do you think we could get Dr. Kim and Dr. Walsh to help with the medical accuracy review?" "I already talked to both of them," Mrs. Garcia replied with a knowing smile. They're both eager to contribute their expertise to a program developed by one of their favorite patients. As the evening progressed and our small family group finalized party preparations, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the community of support that had emerged around us. These weren't people seeking social media validation or spiritual superiority. They were simply kind humans who'd chosen to invest in our well-being because they genuinely cared about our happiness and success. The contrast with Victoria's wellness community couldn't have been more stark. Where Victoria's followers had been drawn to drama, conspiracy theories, and performative spirituality, our current support network was built around practical help, honest communication, and respect for Lily's autonomy and medical needs. The difference had made all the difference in our ability to heal and thrive. Later that night, after Aunt Diane and Mrs. Garcia had gone home and Lily was safely asleep in her room, I sat in the kitchen reviewing the timeline of our recovery. 2 years ago, we'd been traumatized survivors trying to make sense of betrayal and near-death experience. Today we were thriving advocates with a clear sense of purpose and a strong foundation of genuine relationships. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been setbacks, therapy sessions that left us both emotionally drained and moments when the weight of everything we'd experienced felt overwhelming. But we'd persevered together, supported by professionals who prioritized our actual well-being over their own theoretical approaches to healing. My phone buzzed with a message from the podcast producer, thanking us again for Lily's willingness to share her story and letting us know that the episode would air in 2 weeks. The timing felt perfect, just after her birthday celebration, and just before her summer theater program began. She'd be entering this new phase of her life with her voice clearly established and her advocacy platform well developed. As I locked up the house and turned off the lights, I passed Lily's bedroom door and could hear her practicing lines for the musical, her voice strong and confident as she worked through the complex harmonies. The sound filled me with hope for her future and pride in everything she'd accomplished, despite the obstacles Victoria had tried to place in her path. Victoria's attempt to silence Lily had failed completely. Instead of creating a compliant victim dependent on adult approval, her manipulation had produced a confident advocate who trusted her own instincts and wasn't afraid to challenge authority when necessary. The irony was perfect. Victoria's worst impulses had helped create exactly the kind of strong, independent young woman she'd tried to prevent Lily from becoming. Tomorrow would bring Lily's 17th birthday party, surrounded by friends who valued her for her authentic self rather than her potential usefulness to their own agendas. Next month would bring the summer theater program where she'd continue developing talents that Victoria had tried to suppress in favor of more photographable spiritual practices. And in the fall, she'd begin her senior year of high school with college applications that reflected her genuine interests and abilities, rather than someone else's vision of who she should become. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain but genuinely ours to shape. Victoria's voice had been permanently silenced by prison walls and legal consequences, but Lily's voice grew stronger every day. She'd learned to trust her instincts, advocate for her needs, and use her experience to help protect other children from similar harm. These weren't lessons any child should have to learn, but since life had forced them upon her, she'd transformed them into gifts that would serve her and others for the rest of her life. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that love had triumphed over manipulation, truth had overcome lies, and a child's innate wisdom had proven stronger than an adult's calculated cruelty. Victoria had tried to write Lily's story as a tragedy, but we'd rewritten it as a testament to resilience, recovery, and the power of authentic human connection. The last thing I heard before sleep claimed me was the sound of Lily's voice, no longer practicing lines but humming contentedly as she settled into bed. It was the sound of safety, of healing completed and future possibilities, of a life reclaimed, and a voice that would never again be silenced by someone else's agenda. It was the sound of victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.